The old community theater in Pinewood Hills had seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls in small curls, and the red velvet seats had faded to a dusty rose after years of use. But to Richard Hayes, it was still the most beautiful place in town. He'd been the theater director there for almost 20 years, and these days, his excitement for the annual musical was wearing thin. Richard tapped his pen against his clipboard as he checked the time. The open auditions for Oliver had been running since 9 in the morning, and it was now well past 3 in the afternoon. His back ached from sitting in the same chair, and his patience was running out. "Next," he called out, not bothering to hide the tiredness in his voice. No one appeared on stage. Richard looked toward his assistant, Lisa, who shrugged and checked her list. "I think that's everyone who signed up," she said. Richard sighed and began gathering his notes. Another year, another cast of the same faces from around town. Mrs. Wilson from the bakery would play the widow again. Tom from the hardware store would be Bill Sykes for the 3rd time. The high school drama teacher would take the female lead because no one else could hit the high notes. "Excuse me," a small voice called from the back of the theater. "Am I too late to try out?" Richard squinted into the darkness. A boy walked slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty theater. He looked about 12 or 13, skinny with messy brown hair that fell across his forehead. He wore jeans with a hole in one knee and a faded blue hoodie that seemed 2 sizes too big. "Auditions were scheduled until 4, Richard said, checking his watch. "You've got 15 minutes. What's your name?" "Ben," the boy said, climbing the steps to the stage. "Ben Taylor." Richard added the name to his list. "Any experience, Ben?" The boy shook his head. "Not really. I sing in the shower sometimes." Lisa laughed softly, but Richard didn't smile. He'd heard it all before. Every year someone wandered in thinking talent was just waiting to be discovered. Usually it wasn't. "What will you be singing for us today?" Richard asked, already writing a polite rejection note on his form. "Amazing Grace," Ben replied, his voice barely audible from the stage. Richard looked up, surprised. Most kids came in wanting to sing the latest pop songs. That's an interesting choice. "Do you need the piano accompaniment?" Ben shook his head again. "I can sing it on my own if that's okay." "That's fine," Richard said. He leaned back in his chair and waved his hand. "Whenever you're ready." Ben stood in the center of the stage, looking small under the bright lights. His hands were shoved deep in his hoodie pockets and his shoulders hunched forward. He looked down at his worn sneakers, then closed his eyes, and then he just stood there. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence in the theater grew uncomfortable. Lisa shifted in her seat. The piano player, old Mr. Reynolds, raised his eyebrows at Richard. "Look, kid," Richard called out, his voice echoing through the theater. "We don't have all day. If you're not ready—" "I'm ready," Ben said, his eyes still closed. "I just need a moment." Richard felt a flash of irritation. He'd seen this before, too. The stage fright, the freezing up, then the tears and embarrassment. It was cruel to let it continue. "Ben," he said, trying to sound kind but firm, "maybe this isn't the right time. You can come back next year when you've had more practice, please," Ben said, opening his eyes. "Just one chance." Something in the boy's face made Richard pause. It wasn't the usual desperate hope he saw in wannabe stars. It was something quieter, more determined. "Fine," Richard said, checking his watch again. "But we really do need to wrap this up soon." Ben nodded and closed his eyes again. The seconds ticked by. Richard's patience snapped. "Look, son," he called out, his voice sharp with frustration. "We have things to do today. If you're going to sing, sing. If not, thank you for coming, but—" "I just need to find the right place in my head," Ben interrupted. "My mom says good singing comes from somewhere deep inside you, not just your voice." Richard almost laughed. "Who was this kid?" "Is that so?" he asked, not hiding his sarcasm. "Well, maybe you can find that special place a bit faster. We close the theater at 5. Ben's face flushed red, but he didn't leave the stage. Instead, he took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. "I can do this." "Then prove it," Richard challenged, leaning forward in his seat. "Prove to me that you belong on my stage. Show me something I haven't heard in this town before." The moment the words left his mouth, Richard regretted them. That was too harsh. The boy was just a kid, probably pushed into this by well-meaning parents who thought their child was special. Richard had seen it 100 times before. Lisa shot him a disapproving look, but it was too late to take back the challenge. Ben stood straighter on the stage, his eyes finding Richard's in the dim theater. For a moment, something passed between them, a flash of determination in the boy's gaze that caught Richard off guard. "I will," Ben said simply. The theater fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different, charged, waiting. Ben closed his eyes one last time, took another deep breath, and then began to sing. Richard had heard Amazing Grace countless times over the years. Church choirs, school concerts, even professional performances. He thought he knew what to expect, a nervous, off-key rendition from a boy whose voice might be starting to change. What he heard instead stopped his heart for a beat. The first note filled the theater with a clarity that seemed impossible. Pure and true, it hung in the air like crystal, and then Ben continued, each word perfectly formed, each note precisely pitched with a control that professional singers spent years trying to master. But it wasn't just the technical perfection that made Richard's clipboard slip from his fingers. It was the feeling behind the words. This skinny boy in his too big hoodie wasn't just singing a song, he was telling a story with his voice. The words "that saved a wretch like me" carried such genuine emotion that Richard felt goosebumps rise on his arms. Lisa's mouth had fallen, open. Mr. Reynolds at the piano had turned completely around on his bench to stare at the stage, and Richard couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe as Ben's voice soared through the verses, filling every corner of the old theater with sound that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. When Ben reached the line, "I once was lost, but now am found," his voice lifted to a higher register that should have been impossible for a boy his age. The note was so pure, so perfect, that Richard felt a lump form in his throat. In all his years in theater and all the performances he'd seen and directed, he had never heard anything like it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The final note faded into silence, leaving the theater in a stillness so complete that Richard could hear the old building creaking around them. Ben opened his eyes, looking uncertain. "Was that okay?" he asked into the silence. Richard couldn't speak. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. It wasn't possible. Children didn't sing like that without years of training, without natural gifts so rare they came along once in a generation, if that. "Where?" Richard finally managed, his voice hoarse. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Ben shrugged, looking uncomfortable under their stares. "Nowhere, really. I just sing a lot at home. My mom says I've been singing since before I could talk." "Who's your mother?" Richard asked, still trying to understand. "Is she a singer?" "A music teacher. She works at the diner on Main Street," Ben said. "She's a waitress." Richard stood up from his seat, walking slowly down the aisle toward the stage. "And your father? Does he have a musical background?" A shadow crossed Ben's face. "I don't have a dad. It's just me and my mom." Richard reached the edge of the stage and looked up at the boy, seeing him properly for the first time. There was nothing remarkable about him, just a regular kid with worn clothes and a haircut that looked like his mom had done it at the kitchen table. Nothing to suggest the extraordinary talent he possessed. "Have you ever had singing lessons?" Richard pressed. "School choir? Church group?" Ben shook his head. "We can't really afford extra stuff like that. And our church is small, they don't have a choir." Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, still trying to process what he had heard. In his 20 years as a director, he had never experienced anything like this moment. He had challenged this boy, expecting nothing, and instead had discovered something remarkable. "Ben," he said slowly, "would you be willing to sing something else for us?" Ben shifted from one foot to the other on the stage, surprised by the strange look on the director's face. He hadn't expected the man to ask him to sing again. Usually, grown-ups just patted him on the head and said nice things without really meaning them. "What would you like me to sing?" Ben asked, his voice quiet but steady. Richard stood at the edge of the stage, still trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "Do you know any show tunes? Anything from a musical?" Ben thought for a moment, then nodded. "I know Where Is Love from Oliver. My mom and I watched the movie version last Christmas." Richard's eyebrows shot up. It was perfect, the very show they were casting. "Yes, please. That would be excellent." He turned to Mr. Reynolds at the piano. "Stanley, can you play it?" The old piano player nodded, turning back to his instrument. "Key of E-flat?" Ben nodded, surprising Richard again. The boy knew what key he sang in. Mr. Reynolds played the introduction, his fingers moving gracefully across the yellowed keys of the old piano. When Ben's cue came, he took a deep breath and began to sing again. If Richard had thought the first song was impressive, this one left him speechless. The character of Oliver was meant to be a lonely, hopeful orphan boy, and Ben captured that feeling perfectly. His clear, pure voice filled the theater with such honest emotion that Richard found himself holding his breath. Every note was perfect, but it was more than technical skill. The boy was actually acting through his voice, becoming the character in a way that seasoned performers struggled to achieve. When the song ended, there was complete silence in the theater. Then Lisa, who had been watching from her seat, began to clap. Mr. Reynolds joined in from the piano bench, and soon Richard found himself applauding too. Ben's cheeks turned pink. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" Richard asked again, still not quite believing what he had heard. Ben shrugged. "I just listen to music a lot, and I practice in my room. Our apartment has thin walls though, so I have to be quiet most of the time." Richard shook his head in wonder. This was raw, natural talent, the kind that came along maybe once in a lifetime if you were lucky enough to discover it. "Ben, how old are you?" he asked. 13, the boy replied. "Almost 14 in December." Richard glanced at his watch. It was nearly 4:30, and they were supposed to be finished with auditions, but he couldn't let this boy walk out the door without knowing more. "Would you mind waiting here for a few minutes? I'd like to talk to my team." Richard motioned to Lisa and Mr. Reynolds to join him in the back of the theater. Once they were out of Ben's earshot, Richard turned to his colleagues. "Am I going crazy, or is that the most incredible voice you've ever heard come out of a child?" "It's extraordinary," Lisa agreed, her eyes wide. "And he's completely untrained? No lessons at all?" "So he claims," Richard said, glancing back at the stage where Ben stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets. "Stanley, what do you think?" The old piano player shook his head slowly. "In 50 years of playing music, I've never heard a natural talent like that. That boy has a gift, a real gift." Richard nodded, his mind racing. "I want to offer him the lead." "Right now," Lisa's eyes widened, without calling back the other boys who auditioned. "Pete Miller's mother will have a fit. She's been telling everyone her son is perfect for Oliver. Pete Miller can carry a tune, but he's not in the same universe as this kid," Richard said firmly. "Sometimes in theater you make compromises, and sometimes a once-in-a-lifetime talent walks through your door, and you'd be a fool to let them walk back out." Stanley nodded in agreement. "The boy is special, Richard." "No doubt about it. What about his mother?" Lisa asked. "Shouldn't we talk to her first?" "He's only 13. Richard considered this. "You're right. Let's find out more about his situation. But I'm telling you now, I want him for the lead. We'll build the whole show around him if we have to." They walked back to the stage where Ben was still waiting patiently. "Ben," Richard called up to him. "Can you come down here for a minute?" "We'd like to talk to you." The boy nodded and made his way down the steps to join them in the front row of seats. "First of all," Richard began, "that was incredible, truly incredible. I've been directing in this theater for 20 years and I've never heard anyone with your natural ability." Ben looked down at his sneakers. "Thank you," he mumbled, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "We'd like to offer you the lead role in our production," Richard continued. "The part of Oliver. Would you be interested in that?" Ben's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Really? Me?" Richard nodded. "Really? You. But we'd need to speak with your mother first, get her permission since you're under 18. Is there a way we can contact her?" "She's working until 7 tonight," Ben said, "at Lou's Diner on Main Street. But she has a break around 5. I could call her?" Richard checked his watch again. It was nearly that time now. "Even better, why don't we walk over there? I'd like to meet her in person. Explain the commitment involved. Would that be okay with you?" Ben nodded, a small smile finally breaking across his face. "Yeah, that would be great." Lisa volunteered to stay behind and lock up the theater, while Richard and Stanley walked with Ben the 4 blocks to Lou's Diner. As they walked, Richard tried to learn more about the boy. "So, Ben, do you go to school here in town?" he asked. Ben nodded. "Pinewood Middle School. I'm in 8th grade. Do you sing in the school choir?" Ben shook his head. "They have one, but it meets after school. My mom needs me to come straight home most days to watch my little sister until she gets off her first job." Richard exchanged a look with Stanley. "First job? Your mom works 2 jobs?" "Yeah." Ben said matter-of-factly. She's a waitress at the diner during the day and she cleans offices at night. Just until we get caught up on bills, she says. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. It explained the worn clothes, the too big hoodie that probably belonged to someone else before Ben. He thought about the rehearsal schedule for the musical, every afternoon from 4 to 7, with longer sessions on weekends. How would that work for a boy who needed to be home after school? They reached the diner, a typical small-town establishment with red vinyl booths and a long counter with spinning stools. The smell of coffee and fried food greeted them as they entered. It was the lull between the lunch and dinner rushes with only a few customers scattered around the place. "That's my mom," Ben said, pointing to a woman behind the counter. She was wiping down the surface, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired, with lines around her eyes that made her seem older than she probably was. When she glanced up and saw Ben, her whole face changed, lighting up with a smile that erased the fatigue. "Ben, what are you doing here?" she called, putting down her cloth and coming around the counter. She noticed the two men with her son and her smile faltered slightly, uncertainty crossing her face. "Mom, this is Mr. Hayes and Mr. Reynolds from the community theater," Ben said. "I went to their audition today." "You did?" she asked, surprised. "I thought you were going to the library after school." Ben looked down. "I was, but I saw the sign about auditions and thought I'd try." His mother turned to Richard and Stanley, extending her hand. "I'm Diane Taylor. Nice to meet you." Her handshake was firm despite her slim build, and Richard could see where Ben got his expressive eyes. "Richard Hayes," he introduced himself. "I'm the director of the Pinewood Hills Community Theater. And this is Stanley Reynolds, our musical director. Your son auditioned for our production of Oliver today." Diane looked at Ben with a mixture of pride and concern. "Did he? How did it go?" Richard glanced at Stanley, then back to Diane. "Mrs. Taylor, is there somewhere we could talk privately for a few minutes?" "It's important." Worry flashed across her face. "Is everything okay? Ben's not in trouble, is he?" No, Richard assured her quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. We have something important to discuss with you about Ben's future." Diane looked confused but nodded. "I'm due for my break now anyway. We can sit in that booth in the corner." She called to another waitress, "Jenny, I'm taking 15. As they settled into the booth, Ben sitting next to his mother and the two men across from them, Richard tried to think of the best way to explain what had happened that afternoon. How do you tell a mother that her son, who she sees every day, possesses a talent so extraordinary it might change both their lives? "Mrs. Taylor," Richard began, "has Ben ever had any formal vocal training?" Diane shook her head. "No, we've never been able to afford anything like that." "Why?" Richard looked at Ben, then back to his mother. "Because your son has the most remarkable voice I've ever heard in my 20 years of theater direction. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that." Diane's eyes widened, and she turned to look at Ben, who was staring at the table. "He's always had a beautiful voice," she said softly. "He's been singing since he was tiny. But I didn't think—" "It's more than beautiful," Stanley chimed in. "It's exceptional. 1 in a million, maybe more rare than that." Richard leaned forward. "Mrs. Taylor, we'd like to offer Ben the lead role in our production, the part of Oliver. But more than that, I think his talent deserves proper training and opportunities that go well beyond our little community theater." Diane looked overwhelmed. "I don't understand. What are you saying exactly?" Richard took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to explain something so important to a woman he'd just met. He could see the confusion in Diane Taylor's eyes mixed with a mother's natural caution. "What I'm saying is that Ben has a gift," Richard explained gently. "The kind of natural talent that most vocal coaches spend their entire careers hoping to discover just once." Diane looked at her son, who was studying the scratched surface of the table with intense focus. "I know he sings well, but much more than well," Stanley interrupted politely. "Mrs. Taylor, I've played piano for professional opera singers who couldn't do what your son can do naturally." A small frown creased Diane's forehead. "But how is that possible?" "He's never had any training. That's what makes it even more remarkable," Richard said. "Some people are just born with it. It's rare, extremely rare, but it happens. And Ben is one of those people." Diane reached out and took her son's hand. "Is this true, Ben? Did you really sing that well at the audition?" Ben shrugged, still not looking up. "I just sang like I always do." "He was extraordinary," Richard confirmed. "Which is why we're here. We'd like him to play the lead in our production of Oliver, but the rehearsal schedule is demanding. 4 to 7 most weekdays, longer on weekends as we get closer to opening night. The worry returned to Diane's face. That would be difficult. Ben watches his sister Amy after school while I work. And weekends, I pick up extra shifts when I can. Richard nodded, understanding the problem. Is there anyone else who could help with childcare? Family nearby, perhaps? Diane shook her head. It's just us. My parents are in Arizona, and Ben's father... She paused, then simply said, He's not in the picture. Richard and Stanley exchanged glances. The theater had a small budget, certainly not enough to pay for childcare. But letting this talent slip away seemed unthinkable. What if Amy came to rehearsals too? Richard suggested suddenly. She could do homework in the back of the theater. We could make sure she's looked after. Diane looked surprised by the offer. She's only 8. I couldn't impose like that. It wouldn't be an imposition, Richard assured her. Several of our cast members bring their kids. We're like a big family. Lisa, you met her at the theater, Ben. She's great with children. She teaches elementary school during the day. Ben finally looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. Mom, could we try, please? I've never been in a play before, Diane looked torn. I don't know, Ben, it's a big commitment. And what about your schoolwork? We insist on good grades from all our young performers, Richard said. We can set up a homework area at the theater. Many of our student actors find their grades actually improve during production because they learn to manage their time better. Diane still looked uncertain. I'd need to think about it. Talk to my boss about my schedule. Of course, Richard said. We understand completely. But there's something else you should consider. He hesitated, not wanting to overwhelm her but feeling she needed to know the full picture. Ben's talent. It could open doors for him. Scholarship opportunities, specialized arts programs. What kind of opportunities? Diane asked, her voice cautious. There's a summer program at the State University for gifted young vocalists, Stanley spoke up. I know the director personally. If Ben auditioned, I have no doubt he would be accepted. It's free for students who qualify, and it could lead to bigger things. Diane looked at her son with new eyes, as if seeing possibilities she'd never considered. Is that something you'd want, Ben? To study music seriously? Ben nodded, more animated than he'd been all afternoon. I love singing, Mom. It's the best feeling in the world. When I sing, it's like everything makes sense. Diane's eyes softened at her son's words. She turned back to Richard. When would rehearsals start? Next Monday, Richard replied. We have 6 weeks of rehearsal before opening night in December. Diane took a deep breath. I'll need to figure out the logistics, but if Ben really wants to do this, we'll find a way to make it work. Richard smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd been afraid they would lose this remarkable boy to the practical constraints of life. Wonderful. And about the summer program Stanley mentioned, 1 step at a time, Diane said firmly. Let's see how the play goes first. Richard nodded, respecting her caution. Of course. But would it be all right if we arranged for a few people to come see Ben perform? People who might be able to help with his future? Diane hesitated, then nodded slowly. As long as I know about it in advance. Just then, another waitress approached their table. Your 15 is up. We're getting the dinner rush early. Diane glanced at her watch and stood up quickly. I have to get back to work. Ben, do you have homework tonight? Ben nodded. Math and science. Why don't you go to the library like you planned, and I'll pick you up after my shift, she suggested. Then she turned to Richard and Stanley. Thank you for coming to talk to me. I'll make sure Ben is at rehearsal on Monday. As Diane hurried back to work, Richard handed Ben a copy of the script. Here, take this home to read over the weekend. Your main songs are marked. Stanley will work with you one-on-one to make sure you're comfortable with all the music. Ben took the script, running his fingers over the title page with something like reverence. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, I won't let you down. I know you won't, Richard replied, surprised by the sudden lump in his throat. Now go do your homework. Directors like good students as much as good singers. After Ben left for the library, Richard and Stanley stayed for coffee. They needed to discuss how to rearrange the production around their new star. We should keep this quiet for now, Richard suggested, stirring sugar into his cup. I don't want the rest of the cast to have preconceived notions before they hear him sing. Stanley nodded in agreement. Good idea. But Richard, we need to talk about what happens after the show. That boy needs proper training. I know, Richard sighed. but his mother is barely keeping their heads above water. Private voice lessons, special programs, it all costs money they clearly don't have. There are scholarships, Stanley pointed out, and patrons of the arts, people who would support a talent like his. Richard took a sip of his coffee, thinking, let's focus on making this production the best it can be. If Ben shines like I know he will, doors will open. Monday afternoon came quickly. Richard arrived at the theater 2 hours early to prepare for the first rehearsal. He'd spent the weekend rewriting parts of the script to feature Oliver more prominently, giving Ben additional solos to showcase his extraordinary voice. The rest of the cast began to arrive around 3:30. There were the usual suspects, townsfolk, who participated in the community theater year after year, high school drama enthusiasts, a few retirees with time on their hands. They gathered in small groups, chatting about their summers and catching up on local gossip. At exactly 4 o'clock, the door at the back of the theater opened. Ben walked in, still in his school clothes, holding his little sister's hand. Amy was a miniature version of her brother, with the same dark hair and serious eyes. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest and looked around the theater with wide-eyed wonder. Richard walked over to greet them. Ben, Amy, welcome. We've set up a table in the corner for homework and activities. Lisa will be over there if you need anything, Amy. The little girl nodded solemnly but didn't let go of her brother's hand. It's okay, Amy, Ben assured her. You can see me from the table. I'll just be up on the stage. Amy still looked uncertain, but Lisa came over with a warm smile. I hear you're in 3rd grade. I teach 3rd grade. Want to see the special books I brought for you to read while your brother rehearses? Slowly, Amy nodded and allowed herself to be led to the homework corner, though she kept glancing back at Ben. She'll be fine, Richard reassured him. Now, are you ready to meet the rest of the cast? Ben took a deep breath and nodded. I think so. Richard led him to the stage where the other actors had gathered for the first read-through. Everyone, I'd like to introduce Ben Taylor, who will be playing the role of Oliver. There were polite smiles and nods, though Richard noticed a few raised eyebrows. Pete Miller's mother, sitting in the back row to observe the first rehearsal, didn't bother to hide her frown. Before we begin the read-through, Richard announced, I thought it would be good to start with a musical number to warm up. Ben, would you be comfortable singing Where Is Love for Everyone? Ben looked nervous but nodded. Stanley took his place at the piano and played the introduction. The moment Ben began to sing, every whisper in the theater stopped. People who had been shuffling scripts froze. Pete Miller's mother's jaw literally dropped. By the time Ben reached the chorus, several cast members had tears in their eyes. When the song ended, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the theater erupted in applause. Even Pete Miller was clapping enthusiastically, any disappointment at losing the lead role apparently forgotten in the face of such talent. Richard looked around at his cast, seeing the same amazement on their faces that he had felt at the audition. They understood now. They had just witnessed something rare and precious. In the corner, little Amy beamed with pride, her earlier shyness forgotten as she watched her brother receive a standing ovation. Richard caught Stanley's eye across the room. The old piano player gave him a knowing nod. They had made the right decision. Whatever challenges lay ahead, scheduling conflicts, budget constraints, the practical problems of nurturing this talent, they would figure it out. Because some gifts are too precious to ignore. 2 weeks into rehearsals, Richard sat in the back row of the theater, watching Ben work through a difficult scene with the actor playing Fagin. The boy had taken to acting with surprising ease, absorbing direction like a sponge and growing more confident with each passing day. The rest of the cast had quickly accepted him, any initial jealousy fading in the face of his humble attitude and undeniable talent. Take 5, everyone, Richard called out. Let's pick up with the workhouse scene after the break. As the actors dispersed, Richard noticed Ben's sister Amy sitting alone at her homework table. Usually, she had her head buried in books or was drawing pictures, but today she was just staring at her brother with a strange expression. Richard walked over and sat down next to her. Everything okay, Amy? The 8-year-old shrugged, fidgeting with a pencil. I guess. That doesn't sound very convincing, Richard said gently. Something on your mind? Amy looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. When Ben sings, people look at him different. Like he's special, Richard nodded slowly. That's because he has a very rare talent. I know, Amy said. But what if you only get one special thing in your family? What if Ben got all of it? Richard felt his heart squeeze at the worry in her young voice. That's not how it works, Amy. Everyone has their own special gifts. They're just different for each person. But I can't sing like Ben, she said quietly. I tried in my room and I don't sound like that at all. Richard smiled. You know, I can't sing either. Not really, but I can direct. I can help other people tell stories on stage. That's my special thing. Amy considered this. What's my special thing? I'm not sure yet, Richard admitted. But I've noticed how kind you are. How you help the younger kids with their homework while you're waiting for Ben. How you remember everyone's names after meeting them just once. Those are special things too. A small smile tugged at Amy's lips. Really? Absolutely, Richard assured her. And you know who else noticed? Mrs. Wilson, our costume designer. She was just telling me yesterday that she could use a helper with a good eye for detail and a kind heart. Would you be interested in learning about costumes while Ben rehearses? Amy's eyes widened. I could help make the costumes? If it's okay with your mom, Richard nodded. Nothing complicated, maybe sorting buttons or holding fabric while Mrs. Wilson pins it. But it would be a real job, not just busy work. I'd like that, Amy said, sitting up straighter. I'm good at keeping things organized. I bet you are, Richard smiled. I'll talk to Mrs. Wilson right now and we can ask your mom when she picks you up tonight. As Richard walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The truth was, he'd spent most of his life focused on finding and nurturing talent. Measured, quantifiable talent like Ben's extraordinary voice. But watching Amy's face light up at the chance to be included, to contribute in her own way, made him wonder how many other gifts he'd overlooked because they weren't as obvious. The next few weeks flew by. Rehearsals grew more intense as opening night approached. Sets were built, costumes were fitted with Amy's careful assistance, and the music was polished until it shone. Ben continued to astonish everyone with his voice, but what impressed Richard even more was the boy's work ethic. He never complained, never acted like his talent entitled him to special treatment, and always thanked the crew and fellow actors for their help. Richard had kept his promise to Diane, and invited a few special guests to observe rehearsals. Professor Thomas from the State University's music department had come twice, sitting silently in the back row with an unreadable expression. The director of the prestigious Westridge Boys Choir had also attended, taking copious notes. None of them spoke to Ben directly. Richard had been firm about not overwhelming the boy before opening night, but their interest was obvious. 3 days before the show was set to open, disaster struck. Ben didn't show up for rehearsal. Richard tried not to panic as he checked his watch for the 10th time. Ben was never late. In fact, he usually arrived early to warm up his voice with Stanley. But it was now 20 minutes past their start time, and there was no sign of him or Amy. Should we start without him? Lisa asked, sensing Richard's growing concern. Richard was about to agree when the theater door swung open. It was Amy, red-faced and out of breath with no Ben in sight. Amy, what's wrong? Where's Ben? Richard hurried to meet her. Ben's sick, Amy panted, clearly having run all the way from home. Mom says he can't come. He has a really bad sore throat and a fever. Richard felt his stomach drop. A sore throat could be devastating for a singer, especially right before a performance. Where's your mom? Is she with Ben? Amy nodded. She couldn't leave him, but she didn't want you to worry, so she sent me to tell you. I ran all the way from Mrs. Parker's apartment. She watches me sometimes when Mom's at work. Richard put a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. You did the right thing, Amy. Thank you for coming to tell us. He turned to Lisa. Can you run rehearsal today? I need to check on Ben. 20 minutes later, Richard knocked on the door of a small apartment in a worn-down building on the edge of town. Diane opened it, looking exhausted. Mr. Hayes, she said, surprised. You didn't need to come all the way here. Please call me Richard, he reminded her. And of course I came. How is he? Diane stepped back to let him in. The apartment was small but spotlessly clean, with second-hand furniture that had been carefully maintained. He's running a fever of 101, and his throat is so swollen he can barely talk, let alone sing. I took him to the urgent care clinic this morning. They said it's not strep, thankfully, but a bad viral infection. Can I see him? Richard asked. Diane nodded and led him to a small bedroom that Ben shared with Amy. The boy was asleep, his face flushed with fever, breathing through his mouth. A half-empty glass of water sat on the nightstand, along with a bottle of children's ibuprofen. Richard felt his heart sink. Even if the fever broke tomorrow, Ben's voice wouldn't recover in time for opening night. Not to the level it needed to be. "I'm so sorry," Diane said softly, seeing the realization on Richard's face. He was devastated when the doctor said he shouldn't use his voice at all for at least a week. Richard shook his head. It's not his fault. These things happen in theater all the time. He tried to keep his voice upbeat, but the truth was this was a major blow. The entire production had been built around Ben's remarkable talent. Without him, it would be ordinary. Ben stirred and opened his eyes, blinking in confusion when he saw Richard. "Hey, buddy," Richard said gently. "Amy told us you're not feeling well." Ben opened his mouth to speak, but only a painful-sounding croak came out. Tears welled in his eyes. "Don't try to talk," Richard said quickly. "Just rest. That's your only job right now, okay?" Ben reached for a small notepad on his nightstand and scribbled something with a pencil, then held it up for Richard to read. "I'm sorry," it said in a child's awkward handwriting. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "You have nothing to be sorry for. These things happen. We'll figure something out." But as he left the apartment half an hour later, Richard had no idea what that something would be. Pete Miller, the boy who had originally been considered for Oliver, was a decent singer but nowhere near Ben's level. The show was completely sold out. News of a phenomenal young singer had spread through the small town, and people had been fighting for tickets for weeks. Back at the theater, Richard called an emergency meeting with the cast and crew. "Ben is very sick," he announced. "He won't be able to perform on opening night or possibly for the entire run of the show." A murmur of dismay ran through the group. "What are we going to do?" Lisa asked. "Pete knows the part, but all the arrangements were changed to showcase Ben's range. And people are coming specifically to hear Ben sing," Stanley added. "The mayor, the superintendent of schools, not to mention the music directors we invited." Richard took a deep breath. "I know this is a huge challenge, but this is theater, and in theater we adapt. The show must go on, as they say. But how?" someone called out. "The whole show was built around him." Richard was about to respond when a small voice spoke up from the back of the room. "What if we do it for Ben, not with Ben?" Everyone turned to look at Amy, who had been quietly sorting costume pieces. She shrank back a little at the sudden attention but continued bravely. "I mean, Ben works so hard. He's really sad about letting everyone down. What if we do the show in a way that still makes him proud, even if he can't be in it?" Richard felt something click in his mind. "Amy, that's brilliant." "It is?" she asked, surprised. "Absolutely," Richard nodded. "Ideas already forming. We won't try to replace Ben. Instead, we'll transform the show into a tribute." He turned to the group. "Pete, you'll play Oliver with the original arrangements. Stanley, can you rework the overture to include a brief explanation of our young star's illness and dedicate the performance to him?" Stanley nodded thoughtfully. "I can do that. And what if we use some of the rehearsal recordings? I have that wonderful tape from last week when Ben sang Where Is Love perfectly." "Yes." Richard felt energy returning to his body. "We could play it during the curtain call, with a spotlight on an empty chair on stage." The ideas flowed faster now, the initial despair giving way to creative problem-solving. By the end of the evening, they had a new plan. Not as good as having Ben perform live, perhaps, but meaningful in its own way. On opening night, the theater was packed. Richard peeked through the curtain and saw Diane sitting in the front row with Ben beside her, still pale but well enough to attend as an audience member. The boy caught his eye and gave a small thumbs up. As the house lights dimmed and Stanley began the overture, Richard felt a strange calm replace his earlier anxiety. This was what theater was about. Not just showcasing talent, but bringing a community together through challenges and triumphs. The show would be different than planned, but it would still be special. And Ben would have other chances to share his remarkable gift with the world. Richard would make sure of that. The modified opening night of Oliver went better than anyone had dared to hope. Pete Miller performed admirably as Oliver, his confidence growing with each scene. The rest of the cast stepped up too, bringing extra energy to their performances as if trying to fill the gap left by Ben's absence. During the curtain call, when the recorded version of Ben's Where Is Love played through the theater's speakers, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The pure, perfect voice filled the space, somehow more powerful in its absence. The spotlight shone on an empty chair on stage, a simple tribute that spoke volumes. Richard watched from the wings as the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. But his eyes were fixed on Ben, sitting beside his mother in the front row. The boy's face was a mixture of emotions: pride in his friends, disappointment at not being able to perform, and something else Richard couldn't quite name. Wonder, perhaps. Wonder at hearing his own voice as others heard it. After the show, the lobby filled with audience members buzzing about the performance. Richard made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the last-minute changes. He was heading backstage to check on the cast when he felt a tap on his shoulder. "Mr. Hayes? I'm Professor Thomas from the State University. We spoke briefly on the phone." Richard turned to find the distinguished music professor standing with another man he didn't recognize. "Yes, of course, Professor. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm sorry the circumstances weren't what we'd planned." "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss," Professor Thomas said. "Despite the recording quality, I found Ben Taylor's voice remarkable, even more impressive than when I heard him in rehearsal. I'd like to speak with him and his mother if possible." "Of course," Richard said. "They should be near the refreshment table. Let me introduce you." He led the professor through the crowd, to where Diane stood with Ben and Amy, the boy still looking tired but much better than he had a few days ago. "Diane, Ben, this is Professor Thomas from the State University's music department. He's the one I mentioned who came to a couple of rehearsals." The professor shook hands with both of them. "It's a pleasure to meet you properly. Ben, I'm very impressed by your talent. I've heard many young singers in my career, but few with your natural gift." Ben looked down shyly. "Thank you, sir. I'd like to discuss some opportunities that might be available for Ben," the professor continued, addressing Diane. "Our university runs a young artists program during the summer, fully funded for students with exceptional ability. It would include proper vocal training, music theory, and performance opportunities." Diane's eyes widened slightly. "That sounds wonderful, but—" She hesitated, and Richard could guess the concerns running through her mind. Transportation, childcare for Amy, time away from work. "Perhaps we could discuss the details over coffee sometime next week," Professor Thomas suggested, sensing her hesitation. "There's no rush to decide now." Diane nodded gratefully. "That would be better, yes. Thank you." The professor handed her a business card. "Excellent. Please call my office to set up a time. And Ben, I hope you feel better soon. That voice of yours is something special. Take good care of it." As Professor Thomas moved away, the second man who had been standing quietly beside him stepped forward. "Mrs. Taylor, I'm David Wilson, director of the West Ridge Boys Choir. I'd also like to speak with you and Ben when he's feeling better." Richard watched as Diane accepted another business card, looking slightly overwhelmed. The opening night he'd planned had fallen apart, yet somehow, Ben's future opportunities seemed to be expanding rather than contracting. Over the next 2 weeks, Ben's health improved steadily. His voice returned, initially raspy but growing stronger each day. By the final weekend of the show's run, he was well enough to attend every performance, though Richard had decided against having him perform. The risk to his recovering voice wasn't worth it, and the tribute format had proved surprisingly effective. What Richard hadn't expected was how the story of the boy with the amazing voice who couldn't perform would capture the town's imagination. Local papers ran features on Ben and the community theater. People who had never shown interest in the arts were buying tickets to hear the recording and see the empty chair. By the final performance, they had to add extra seating to accommodate the demand. On closing night, Richard found Ben backstage before the show, looking at the costumes with a wistful expression. "How are you feeling?" Richard asked. "Better," Ben said. "My throat hardly hurts at all now." "That's good," Richard nodded. "But I meant, how are you feeling about all of this?" He gestured around the theater. "About missing your big moment on stage." Ben was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "At first I was really sad," he admitted. "I worked so hard, and I wanted to make you and Mom proud." "We are proud," Richard assured him. "Your dedication during rehearsals, The way you've supported the cast even when you couldn't perform. That shows character, Ben. Talent is wonderful, but character is what will carry you through the hard times. Ben nodded slowly. Mom and I met with Professor Thomas yesterday. Oh? Richard tried to keep his tone casual, though his heart rate picked up. How did that go? He wants me to audition for the summer program, Ben said. He thinks I could get a full scholarship. That's fantastic, Richard said sincerely. Will you do it? Ben nodded. Mom said we can try it for one summer and see how it goes. The director from the boys' choir called too. He said they have transportation that picks up kids from different towns, so I wouldn't need a ride. Richard felt a surge of satisfaction. Doors were opening just as he'd hoped. And what about Amy? Did your mom figure out childcare? Ben's face brightened. That's the best part. Mrs. Wilson, the costume lady, she offered Amy a job as her helper this summer. She's going to teach her to sew and pay her a little bit too. Amy's super excited. Richard smiled, thinking of how far they'd all come in just a few weeks. From a skeptical director and a nervous boy to this moment, a future taking shape, full of possibilities none of them had imagined. I have something for you, Richard said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small box and handed it to Ben. Ben opened it carefully. Inside was a simple silver key on a chain. What's this? He asked, confused. It's the key to the back door of the theater, Richard explained. Stanley and I talked about it, and we'd like to offer you free access to the piano and rehearsal space whenever you want to practice. As long as there's not a production going on, you can come in any time. Stanley said he'd give you lessons on the weekends when he's free. Ben stared at the key, then at Richard, his eyes wide. Really? But why would you do that? Richard thought about how to explain something he was still figuring out himself. Because talent like yours needs space to grow. And because 20 years ago someone did something similar for me. She saw something in me and gave me a chance, even though I couldn't afford proper theater school. Sometimes all it takes is one person to believe in you. Ben carefully put the necklace over his head, tucking the key under his shirt. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I'll take good care of it. I know you will, Richard said. Now I need to check on the cast before places. Enjoy the show tonight. 6 months. Later, on a warm spring evening, Richard sat in the State University's concert hall, program in hand. The Young Artists Summer Showcase was the culmination of the program that Ben had been attending twice a week since January, thanks to an early admission granted by Professor Thomas. Richard had driven Diane, Amy, and Ben to every session, using the theater's old van. During the long trips, they'd talked about music, theater, and life. Ben had blossomed under proper training, his natural talent strengthened by technique and theory. But more importantly, he'd found a community that understood and valued his gift. The lights dimmed and the showcase began. Various young musicians performed, pianists, violinists, a flutist, all talented, all clearly well-trained. And then Ben walked onto the stage looking taller somehow in his new dress clothes, bought second-hand but carefully tailored by Amy and Mrs. Wilson. As Ben began to sing an Italian art song, Richard glanced at Diane beside him. Tears shone in her eyes, but she was smiling. On her other side, Amy watched her brother with undisguised pride. The pure, perfect voice that had first captured Richard's attention in the empty theater had grown even more beautiful with training. But there was something else now. Confidence, understanding, intention behind each note. Ben wasn't just singing beautifully, he was telling a story with his voice, reaching out to connect with every person in the audience. When the song ended, the hall erupted in applause. Ben bowed, his face flushed with happiness. As he straightened, his eyes found their small group in the audience, and he smiled directly at them. Richard thought about that day 7 months ago, when he'd challenged a nervous boy to show him something he hadn't seen before. How close he had come to missing this gift because of his own jadedness and assumptions. How a moment of openness had changed not just Ben's life, but his own as well. As Ben began his second piece, Richard closed his eyes and simply listened to the extraordinary voice that had appeared in his ordinary theater.